Hello, and welcome to the Newsfeed Special Talk Show Edition. I'm your host, Connor Reel, and today we'll be talking to some very special guests about a controversial topic that has taken over America. Today, we will be talking about the influence of video games on the youth culture in America. Video games have become part of daily life for many people in the country. 65% of American households play video games and spend an average of 18 hours a week playing. Many parents worry that children spend too much time in front of the TV and talking to strangers through the computer. But is this an outlet for introverts to have a comfortable social life, or is it discouraging kids from healthy face-to-face discussions and outdoor activities? Some free-range create-a-character games provide the player with an alternate world that they can get lost in or even addicted to, while other popular games like Halo or Call of Duty allow the player to actively seek out and eliminate targets. But with the rise of desensitivity towards graphic violence, are these games a way to blow off steam and let go of aggression after a long day, or are they encouraging violence? Speaking with us today about this are Virginia Tech computer science major Dave Kindle. Dave, tell me about your relationship with video games.
Well, I've been playing for quite a long time, early on, and my parents they've paid attention to the ESRB ratings, and so I've known about them for a while, and I've, gone through the steps, and, when I was of age to play unrated games, I would, and, I've currently been even playing through college, and I still continue to today.
All right, thank you, Dave. Next, we have Virginia Tech communications professor, Dr. James Ivory, who is the director of the Gamer Lab. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Connor, what I do here in my research when I'm not teaching is focused on kind of social effects of media, particularly entertainment media, and that would include video games these days.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ivory. And last, but certainly not least, father of two, Paul Spalding. So, you have two sons, Paul. Do they play video games, and what kind of games do they like?
They do play, and they're both avid gamers, and they're more generally interested in the World of Warcraft style games, where the multiplayer games that they can go into the virtual environments. My oldest son is actually what's called a Twitch streamer, in that he has other people watching him play video games. So they're deeply involved.
All right, sounds very interesting. Thank you guys for joining us today for this discussion. We'll start things off with a couple of questions here. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Ivory. Do you consider video game addiction to be a real behavioral addiction on par with things like gambling or drinking?
The science on that should probably seem like it would be simpler than it is. It's a complicated question that the answer is pretty well disputed. It's actually kind of disputed even how much certain substance type addictions qualify as addictions. There's a lot of people that argue about what's an addiction, even at kind of a high level when it comes to food and drink and things like that. So when it comes to something that's not really interacting with you in the same biochemical way, it gets a lot more complicated. Some people use the term addiction kind of loosely, and they include things like video games. A lot of people say that the two shouldn't be compared. I would say that I'm not very comfortable probably using the word addiction, but there's a lot of other terminology that people use, like problematic behavior, that probably is kind of what you have in mind when you say addiction.
All right, sounds good. Dave, based on your personal experiences, how do you feel about that term?
I would definitely agree with that. I think addiction should be reserved for more severe cases, and with video games, you're not physically addicted to a video game. So it's really hard to say that you could use the terms interchangeably. So.
All right, for you, Paul, in your experience with your sons, how do you think spending time playing video games relates to time spent using other media, such as cell phones or television?
Well, these days media has become such an overarching term that they all tend to meld together. While my sons are playing video games, sometimes they'll be on their cell phone, or they'll have other windows on a computer open and be doing other things at the same time. I don't think that lends toward the term addiction as more as it does the term amplification. If you've got a person, be it male or female, that has an underlying psychosomatic problem, then the type of video games and the amount of video game time that they spent in the video game world can amplify the problems that they have.
Okay. For you more specifically as a professor, Dr. Ivory, do you think that video games help or hurt students' or children's learning processes?
I think a lot of times the presence of video games is associated with, or the presence of a lot of video game use, I should say, is associated with higher likelihood of some kinds of problems in some of the research. Video games are so commonly used anymore that it's real difficult to say somebody who plays video games at all is different than somebody who doesn't. It's just sort of like almost a standard kind of condition across a lot of kids, at least in the United States. High video game use, extremely high video game use is sort of correlated with the number of problems in some of the research, but it's very difficult to say whether sort of you have video games causing that problem or whether you're dealing with somebody who's a poor time manager or something like that.
Okay.
Again, it's sort of a little bit of a question what the causal direction is there.
Okay, for you, Dave, in your experiences playing video games while also being a student, do you feel as though it affects your learning process?
I would feel that sometimes it can get in the way, but that's more towards a personal tendency to get distracted. I could easily, get into a video game and start playing and lose track of time and realize that I have to study for my midterm, and I've already spent all this time playing video games, and it's really difficult to realize when you spent too much time. So I would say that yes, there is this correlation between it, but again, it's not actually causation.
Okay, thank you. For you, Paul, with your kids, do you feel as though they're overly distracted by video games, and do you do anything when they're trying to do their homework or they're trying to study as far as not letting them play video games?
Well, we try to prioritize things, and video games come down pretty low on that priority list. There's certain boxes that they have to check around the house before I'm going to turn them loose to just play a game. So from that standpoint, I think the parents themselves can help kids in their time management. That seems to be a fairly common complaint when you're talking about the use of video games. People spend so much time on them. Well, the reason that a lot of time is spent on them is because they're allowed to spend a lot of time on them.
Okay. Dr. Ivory, how do you feel about video games more specifically as a learning tool? Do you think they could be applied that way?
I think when you look at researchers, it's a little bit mixed in terms of how people respond to that, the same as with the addiction type questions. Some people get really, really excited about the potential of video games, and others say there's not a whole lot there. I think, again, you have kind of something where you have a very specific kind of application that might be useful sometimes and not others, not really like a kind of panacea. And that's sort of problematic because, as with all sort of educational tools, it's very difficult to figure out how to apply them and have sort of a uniform positive effect. Some work with some people and some don't.
Okay, Dave, as a video game enthusiast, how do you feel about that?
There is a huge opportunity, in my opinion, to use video games as a tool for learning. You can see currently there's abcmouse.com, which it gets children engaged in video games. And personally, when I was growing up, there was Math Blaster, and that was just such a fun game to play all the time. And it got me learning about math, and I think that's partially why I was drawn to computer science and math when I was in grade school. Was I was engrossed in these games, and they were a great learning tool. And I think that we have this chance to really push it and really utilize this for our children. And that's really my opinion on it. I think that we could leverage it a lot more than we have been, and I think the opportunity is there.
Okay, now, Dr. Ivory, we talked about the addictive qualities of video games earlier. Do you feel like that's something that could require some sort of rehab or therapy to get over?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons people have to be sort of careful when they think about the implications of this research or use terminology like addiction is you kind of have a comparative situation when you're looking at real problems. You can isolate like a correlation that says, oh, on average, kids that play more than 20 hours of video games per week are slightly more likely to have poor performance in school. When it comes to sort of a clinical treatment of an individual, though, the problem is if you privilege something that has sort of a real soft relationship like that, you're probably going to be more likely to ignore the sort of things that cause like real problems like family strife and things like that. So one of the problems with the video game research in general and negative effects is it draws attention away from much more strong effects on negative things that we know about. When you look at clinicians, they're not really that interested in video games. They don't see kids coming in with these horrible problems because of video games. It's mostly more kind of broad social scientists like me trying to isolate these little tiny effects.
Right. Do you feel as though clinicians should be more concerned with this topic?
I would say until we have the resources to get adequate sort of counseling and mental health care and treatment for a lot of kids that really need help for some really serious problems, video games aren't really on the radar right now. Like, for example, a kid that's physically abused is 1/3 more likely than a kid who's not to end up in the prison system. And video games don't even pop up on the radar when you're trying to solve problems like that.
Right, okay. For you, Dave, do you feel as though at any part during your life, during your video game playing life, if you will, that you've been addicted to them?
I wouldn't say addicted. I'd say I didn't have anything better to do, so I was playing video games. And that was the majority of my high school. I'd come home and play some video games and then go to bed and do the same thing the next day. But it wasn't so much of an addiction because when I came to college, I didn't even bring my Xbox here, and I was able to work with my studies just fine. And so it wasn't an addiction because I didn't really feel like I was trying to break any kind of habit, even though it was a habit, but it wasn't really trying to break anything. It felt just natural coming here and not even having it.
Okay, all right, well thank you guys very much. That's going to be the end of segment 1. Coming up, we will be discussing the growing level of violence in video games. Are they desensitizing people to violence? And then later we will be discussing the social and ethical side of video games.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course. Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
All right, in case you're just tuning in, we've been discussing video games and their role in society. We have Dave Kindle, Dr. Ivory, and Paul Spaulding with us today. So far, we've been talking about video game addiction, and we've also been talking about video games as a learning tool and if they're negative or positive for the learning process. Now, we'll be moving on to our next topic. I'm going to start with you here again, Dr. Ivory. What do you think of the theory that violent video games serve as an outlet for players who would otherwise commit violent acts, basically satisfying their craving for violence?
Anytime you're asking about effects of violent video games especially, you could put 5 different researchers in this chair and you'd get 5 different answers. So it's another area where there's a lot of conflict about what's found and especially about what to do with what we know. When it comes to the idea that playing violent video games makes you feel sort of better or makes you not be aggressive, there's a little more agreement on that there's not a lot there. This sort of catharsis idea that doing sort of angry stuff in media is a good way to not be angry is sort of problematic because you're basically just sort of practicing bad behavior. So that's actually an area that people don't tend to disagree as much on, the idea that it sort of makes aggression and things go away. Now, the idea that violent video games cause aggression at a societal level is a lot more disputed. But the idea that it sort of makes somebody who would otherwise be aggressive get it out of their system it sort of doesn't work. It's sort of like saying that, if you want to get really tired, you should go run around a bunch. Well, that kind of makes sense, but not in the short term. And in the long term, that's not really the way to run out of energy, is it?
Okay. Dave, for you, have you ever felt as though video games are an outlet for any frustrations you're feeling or anything like that?
I never used it so much of an outlet in those terms, but I have used it as a form of escapism. So I would come back and play some video games just to take my mind off of the world, essentially. So I wouldn't use it to, go play some Halo and kill some people and feel better afterwards. I would just, forget about my troubles for an hour or two, and then come back and I would be able to, focus on the world again.
Okay, so would you say, for instance, that if you were having some sort of problems outside of your video game playing, that playing video games could clear your head or help you work through these problems?
Probably not work through the problems, but they would give me a break from the problems. It's not meant to be a solution for me. It's just a way to, forget about them for a while.
Paul, as a father, how do you feel about this topic?
As far as using it as a substitute for doing real violence to people, that doesn't make any sense to me at all. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me from a parenting standpoint to say that it's going to cause my kids to be violent. But I come from a different parenting aspect than somebody from, say, a single parent who's never there and the video games are being babysitters. And I think of the unfortunate tragedy that happened in Sandy Hook. A lot of people tried to pin that toward the video games when there was actually some serious sociopathic tendencies in that young man that his mother ignored for a long period of time. And he would use the video games as an escape tool, but they obviously didn't help him at all. So from that standpoint, neither of those arguments make a lot of sense to me. It all goes back to good parenting from the start, and then the video games become just another hobby.
So you say more specifically that you don't have a problem with your kids playing violent video games. You don't think that it encourages violence. What makes you feel that way?
Because my kids are more balanced than that. They don't always just play violent video games. Occasionally they will play something fairly violent, but at the same time, I also can go to the school and see my son helping a kid with disabilities around the school. And I see my other son volunteering for a Relay for Life things. There's a balance in their life that the video games are a part of, but they don't overwhelm things.
Okay, so would you say that if you hadn't been so present as a parent and your kids weren't so well balanced, that video games could potentially cause them to lean more towards violence?
Not necessarily, but they could amplify a violent tendency that was already there.
Okay, for you, Dr. Ivory, how do you feel about this? Are parents more responsible for whether or not violent video games lead to violent tendencies?
Yeah, I think no matter who you're looking at along the range of opinions among researchers about sort of negative effects of violence, they'll all agree that the big effects on whether you're, a good person, whether you commit aggressive acts, things like that, are other things besides media, your family, your peers, and things like that. The disagreement is whether something like being exposed to a lot of video game violence can have a little tiny effect on top. So if you're sort of already predisposed, is that going to be the little tiny straw that broke the camel's back? And some people argue that, yeah, that's an important little bit. You're sort of being around messages that teach you bad things, or you're got it on your mind. And then other people argue it's really not enough to matter. So nobody's really arguing that you take like among the research community, nobody's really arguing you take like a person with a great environment and then throw video games at them and they become some sort of monster. The argument's more sort of on these little tiny pushes. My point of view is, again, sort of when you look at the kind of problems that we need to spend resources on, we're not ready to even probably worry about video games yet. When it comes to things like crime, we don't have much data that show much of anything because it's very hard to understand why serious violent crime happens sometimes, like things like mass crimes. We don't really understand. Secret Service doesn't understand. Nobody understands too much. They're very difficult to predict. When it comes to little things like maybe being more likely to shove somebody on the playground, there's a little bit of a dispute there.
Okay. I'm going to stick with you for this next one, Dr. Ivory. Where do you fall on the proverbial chicken or the egg question of, do violent and aggressive people seek out violent video games, or is it more the other way around?
There's some people that argue that violent video games cause violence. There's some people that argue that more aggressive people seek both of those out. I think for the most part, they're probably pretty independent of each other, except for historically one big thing, that young males prefer violent video games and young males are more aggressive. I think that that's sort of more of a coincidence than anything, though. So we may not see much of a link anymore as time goes on.
Okay. Paul, again, do you have a line that you draw with how much violence is allowed in the video games that you let your children play?
I tend to lean on the ESRB ratings that Dave referenced earlier. Those are pretty heavily researched, and there's a reason that they're out there, so that's pretty much my line.
Okay. For you, Dave, how do you feel about these ratings? Do you find them accurate?
I would definitely say so. And the reason for that is younger people have a tendency to be more influenced by what they see. They tend to act them out more. I mean, you can think of toddlers, they're imitating what they see, and that's how they learn. So as you grow up, you become more independent and you think for yourself. So as you grow up, I think there should be a sliding scale like the ESRB provides. And so, you have this rating system of when you're a teen, now you can play these games because you're considered that much mature. And obviously they're not going to work for everybody. They simply can't. But it's a good enough scale. It's worked in the past, and I feel that it's appropriate.
Okay, when you were a child, did your parents draw a line as far as what video games you could play or not play?
There definitely was a line. My parents, I wouldn't say rigorously checked the ESRB ratings, but they knew about them. And there was definitely consensus when I went to buy a video game about whether the game was going to be good for me or not, or maybe not good for me because it's just it's entertainment, so But they would make a decision, and not just on the ESRB rating, but the game itself and reviews and what other people have said about it. So they would take it into account.
All right, thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. Thank all of you guys for your contributions in that segment. We're going to go to our second break now. Coming up after that break, we will be discussing the social and ethical side of video games. Are they encouraging communication or fostering solitude? All of that when we return.
Really?
Buzz. Woods, what's up, man? You left some leaves burning out here.
Yeah, I just came in just for a second.
Come on, man. If it's too hot to touch, it's too hot to leave. You could torch the whole neighborhood.
It's a good point there, Smokey.
9 out of 10 wildfires are caused by humans.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Welcome back to our final discussion of video game culture. We just finished our discussion on the controversial issue of video game violence and are now moving on to talking about the social impact of video games. Dr. Ivory, once again, I'm going to come to you first. Do you equate having a strong social presence online with other gamers to social success in real life? And do you feel as though this leads to marginalization in the real world?
Yeah, it's an important question you're asking because I think for a long time researchers like me have sort of focused on what video games do to people, whereas the questions now are really what do people do with each other in video games. Again, there are some people that are big proponents of all the different kinds of things you can do online with other people and build values, and I think in general we don't necessarily know a lot about how that works. Again, we know that most kind of what you'd call normal kids interact with other people online, so it's difficult to say it's a good or bad thing when it's kind of something that almost every kid in our kind of US society is doing. I think that one problem we see online a lot is sort of how people interact in environments where building community is not rewarded, like video games where you pop up for 10 minutes, shoot at each other, call each other names, and leave. It's probably not a real healthy social structure any more than, sometimes people aren't that nice to each other when they're just driving by each other on the interstate. But in the video games where there's a little more community structure, you probably see some good things happening. I'm not sure that there are things that you can't experience elsewhere, though.
Okay, for you, Dave, are you part of an online community? And if yes, how do you feel about this question?
I've never really been part of a huge online community, but I have played multiplayer games with my friends, and I have argued it as a substitute for a real-life interaction, but I don't feel that it has been. Even now, I can't really say that it's the same as face-to-face communication because there's some messages that are lost when you're just talking to friends online, or when you're talking to strangers online. Like you mentioned, there is a lot of a bad that could come when you're just talking with a couple strangers for 10 minutes and then you drop out. There are some community structures in place, like for World of Warcraft or such, where you join a guild and could actually work with them for months at a time. And there might be some good there, but I've never actually played those games, so I haven't necessarily experienced it. And then there's other communities built around gaming that have this structure to it that fosters interaction, but isn't even for specific games. I actually am part of a group that does speed running, which is playing a video game as fast as possible. And there's a lot of interaction between people trying to get the fastest time. So they talk and develop these routes and strategies to achieve these goals for whatever game they're talking about. So there is a lot of good that can come of it too, because you do get to talk with people from all over the world. So there is some good to it.
All right, Paul, for you specifically in regards to your children?
I've seen mixed results in that area. And I say that, I'll use my oldest son that's at college as an example. He is a committed member of an online community. He plays a game called Smite, which is similar to World of Warcraft. He actually is on a team. Now, he's in Lynchburg, Virginia. Part of his team's in California, part of it's in Florida, part of it's in Quebec. But they meet online and they go play matches. And they know each other very well. And he's very into the whole online community. And then sometimes he calls me and complains that nobody invites him to parties at college. And that's when I tell him to turn off the computer and go outside and interact with some real people. So there's a good side and a bad side to both of it. An interesting thing that's popping up is the fact that of the whole esports phenomenon. It has he's involved in the esports where there actually people are making a living doing this now, going out and gaming. And he just recently watched the Smite World Championship, which was held in Atlanta, and the winning team walked away with $10 million. Wow. So we're talking about it's starting to cross lines into economics that we haven't seen in the past. And so he's starting to see that as, maybe this is what I want to do for a living. And he's actually started his own streaming channel to where people log on and watch him play the same way we're going to walk out of here and watch March Madness, watch basketball players play. It's become a sport to the people out there as well as a hobby.
Okay, for you, Dr. Ivory, video games, do you think that they pose more of a threat to society for their mental effects or their physical effects on the youth?
Yeah, I think, again, you kind of have sort of an issue where it depends on kind of what is being replaced by video games. The thing about all leisure activities is most of them aren't the most productive things in the world, so you're always not doing something else. If you're playing a video game instead of eating healthy or doing healthy social interactions or taking care of school responsibilities, it's problematic. If you're playing video game instead of watching TV or going out and drinking 10 beers or something, that's not as problematic. So it's kind of probably a lot of the questions about whether video games are good or bad for an individual, and again, kind of socially or physically, probably depend on what it's replacing. Is it replacing other media use, or is it replacing healthy things? And that's kind of more about the person using it than anything.
All right, Dave, as an avid gamer, do you ever feel like it's had any negative effects on your health, mentally or physically?
I can't say that it has, because I participated in sports all growing up, and now I still like to think that I will go out and exercise, but it's not video games that have replaced that. I don't play video games so much now that I don't go out and exercise. I do homework instead, and they're really, like you said, there isn't really a substitute. It's really tough to say, but there are some times where if people are having these problematic behaviors and just playing video games all day, that they're not even, they wake up, they sit at the computer for 12 hours straight and then go to bed. And they don't really even get outside, and that could be problematic. But to say that, playing a couple of hours of video games is that you can't really make that argument because you don't know what they would be replacing with.
Okay, for you, Dr. Ivory, what do you think the next step is for researchers when it comes to video games?
I think we've got a couple things we've been looking at some, but they haven't been getting enough attention. It's really exciting to look at a really gory video game and say, oh, is this bad for you? And it's kind of complicated to say whether that will override somebody's values. One example that gets more and more attention lately, especially with some of the kind of popular scandals that have been going on, is the way video games handle gender and women and bodies and things like that. I think that's a lot less of a complicated question. You have sort of a very kind of toxic sort of culture there in terms of the way that industry tends to portray women. And I think that's getting better, but slowly. And I think that you also have a similarly somewhat toxic culture among some groups that play video games. Not everybody, but enough to be a little bit of a problem. And I think that's a lot less complex question, because if you have a kid robbing cars and shooting strangers in a video game, I find that morally objectionable, but it's very likely he has parents who say don't really do that. A kid who is interacting with women in terms of on video games, judging them by unrealistic body standards, over-sexualizing them, may not have somebody in the house that says this isn't really how men and women interact. So I think you have a bigger problem there that we're getting better at looking at.
Okay, for you, Paul, what kind of information would you like to see out there in terms of how you're parenting your kids in relation to video games?
To me, this all comes down to balance. I mean, it's more about the way you're raising your kids than it is what video games they happen to be playing at a time. If you have a well-balanced child and you're paying attention to the ESRB ratings and putting the proper materials in front of them, whatever that may be for that particular person, I don't see a whole lot of issues arising. And a lot of the people that I know with children they're not having problems with those. The ones that you see the problems with are the people that aren't monitoring what their children are doing, not only on the video game but on the playground. It's people that are not paying attention to their children that are causing more of the problems than what the children are playing on the screen.
Thank you very much. That wraps up our discussion on video games and how they're influencing America's culture. I just wanted to say one more thank you to all of our guests, and from all of us in the studio, we hope you have an excellent day, and thank you for joining us.